They called him the master of Europe. By the autumn of 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte had bent the continent to his will. Austria had fallen, Prussia was broken. Russia had become an uneasy ally. Only Britain remained, clinging to its windswept island, shielded by a navy that no French soldier could march across. But empires do not collapse in a single day. They erode slowly, from the edges inward by overreach, by hubris, by the illusion that one man can shape all history to his liking. And in a dusty corner of southwestern Europe, where peasants still revered the church and ancient kings ruled more by inertia than vision, Napoleon would stumble into a war that would bleed him for years. A war that began with a lien ended with a ghostly retreat through the frozen mountains. What made Spain, of all places, the graveyard of Napoleon's ambitions? Why did an emperor who had conquered half of Europe fail to pacify a nation fragmented by monarchy, poverty, and pride? And how did this theater of war shape the rise of Britain's greatest military commander and set the stage for the eventual fall of an empire? To understand the storm that would engulf the Iberian Peninsula, we must go back to a single decision that seemed logical in the moment, and yet would prove catastrophically short-sighted. Napoleon's so-called Continental System was never just economic policy. It was total war and disguise, bid to starve Britain of trade, bankrupt its industries, and force its government to sue for peace. Every territory under Napoleon's influence was expected to comply. Ports were shut. British goods were outlawed. Traders who defied the blockade were punished harshly. But there was one stubborn exception. Portugal. Portugal had been Britain's oldest ally. It relied on British trade for survival, and it refused to obey Napoleon's orders. This tiny act of defiance was intolerable to an emperor who demanded absolute loyalty, so Napoleon sent an army under General Jean-Andoche Junot to cross Spain and occupy Lisbon. Ostensibly, this was a campaign to punish Portuguese disobedience. In truth, it was the beginning of something far more sinister. Spain, nominally an ally of France, had agreed to help with the invasion. But Napoleon harbored no illusions about Spain's rulers. The Bourbon monarchy was decadent and divided. King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand despised each other. The real power rested with Manuel Godoy, the Queen's rumored lover and a man widely detested by the people. Spain, in Napoleon's eyes, was a decaying carcass ripe for conquest, and incapable of defending itself. By the spring of 1808, French troops had taken up strategic positions throughout Spain. Officially, they were there to help guard the country against a possible British landing. In reality, they were seizing control. The Spanish people, long humiliated by foreign manipulation, saw through the pretense. Anger began to boil. Riots broke out in March at Aranjuez, where Godoy was nearly torn apart by an enraged mob. The Bourbon court, increasingly fearful, accepted Napoleon's invitation to take refuge in Bayonne, just across the French border. It was a trap. On May 2nd, 1808, the people of Madrid rose up against the occupying French troops, armed with knives, stones, and raw fury. They attacked Napoleon's elite Mamelukes Middle Eastern cavalry known for their ferocity. The French responded with calculated brutality. Dozens were gunned down in the streets. More than 100 were executed by firing squad the next morning. The uprising, later immortalized by Francisco Goya's searing paintings, marked the beginning of what the Spanish would call their Guerra de Independencia, War of Independence. Meanwhile, in Bayonne, Napoleon forced King Carlos to abdicate. Ferdinand, the heir, was also brushed aside. In their place, Napoleon installed his brother Joseph as the new king of Spain. It was, in his mind, a tidy solution. A modern constitution would replace feudal chaos. French order would replace Spanish backwardness. Civilization, Napoleon believed, would prevail. He could not have misjudged the situation more profoundly. The Spanish were outraged. Not only had their monarchy been hijacked, they had been handed over to a foreign occupier they saw as godless. French revolutionary ideals were still toxic in deeply Catholic Spain. Priests denounced Napoleon as the Antichrist. Villagers took up arms. Guerrilla bands began to form. These were not professional armies, nor did they follow the rules of war. They were peasants, merchants, even women, attacking French patrols, ambushing supply wagons, executing collaborators. The French struck back with even greater cruelty, burning villages, killing hostages, and leaving behind a trail of bodies. There were no innocents in this war. At first, it seemed the revolt would be crushed. French forces besieged Gerona, Valencia, and Zaragoza. The Spanish army of Galicia was defeated at Medina del Rioseco. The rebellion appeared to be collapsing. Then, unexpectedly, came Bailen. As French General Dupont withdrew from Cordoba with a massive train of looted treasure, his divisions were surrounded near the town of Bailen by Spanish forces under General Francisco Castaños. After a bloody fight, Dupont surrendered. 18,000 French soldiers laid down their arms, the first major capitulation by a Napoleonic army since the emperor had come to power. Half of those prisoners would later die in captivity. Bailen shocked Europe. It emboldened Napoleon's enemies and stunned his allies. More importantly, it lit a fire in Spain. Zaragoza, which had been on the brink of surrender, now held firm. Guerrilla activity spread. The French garrisons became fortresses under siege. Joseph Bonaparte, newly crowned and thoroughly unwelcome, was forced to flee Madrid. And on the 1st of August, 1808, a new player entered the war. From the gray Atlantic mist off the coast of Portugal, sails appeared carrying Britain's answer to Napoleon's overreach. A small British expeditionary force, commanded by a little-known general named Arthur Wellesley, had landed to aid the Portuguese resistance and begin what would become one of the most relentless campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars. Wellesley, later to become the Duke of Wellington, was cautious, methodical, and fiercely disciplined. In contrast to the flamboyant and ego-driven French marshals, Wellesley was unassuming, reserved, but deadly effective. His army, though small and newly assembled, was well trained, organized, and cohesive. Unlike the fragmented and often disoriented Spanish forces they had come to support. On the 17th of August, Wellesley met the French in his first test at the Battle of Rolisa. There, on rugged, sloping terrain, his men maneuvered deftly and drove back a smaller French force. It was a modest victory, but it set the tone. 4 days later, at the Battle of Mayo, Wellesley defeated Junot's main army. French attacks were repulsed with bayonets and disciplined volleys. The British had drawn blood, and the myth of French invincibility, already shaken on Bailen, began to crack further. But victory would not last long, at least not in the hands of politics. Wellesley was replaced by his superior officer, Sir Hugh Dalrymple, who promptly negotiated the Convention of Sintra. The agreement allowed Junot and his army to return to France aboard British ships with all their weapons, loot, and dignity intact. The terms horrified the British public. Parliament erupted in outrage. An official inquiry later cleared Wellesley of blame, but Dalrymple's career was finished before it began. Napoleon, now fully alarmed, decided that Spain required his personal attention, the humiliation at Belen, the collapse of French control, and the looming threat of British intervention demanded a show of imperial force. He gathered a fresh army 130,000 strong, including many of his elite troops, hardened veterans of Austerlitz and Jena. This was no occupation force. This was the Grande Armée. On the 7th of November, 1808, Napoleon crossed into Spain. His strategy was swift, brutal, and designed to break the back of the rebellion before it could coalesce. The Spanish armies, already weakened, were no match for the emperor's precision. At Burgos, at Tudela, they were shattered. Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's most ruthless commanders, routed General Castagnosta, very man who had triumphed at Balen-Sending, his forces fleeing in disarray. Everywhere the French advanced, resistance melted before them. Napoleon, determined to strike a blow that would echo through Europe, pushed rapidly toward Madrid. North of the capital, 8,000 Spanish troops held the pass at Sommazera, Napoleon's final obstacle. Impatient with delay, Napoleon ordered the Polish light horse of his imperial guard to charge the heavily defended Spanish artillery positions. It was a suicide mission, but the Polish cavalry obeyed. They rode straight into the guns, suffering terrible losses, but they broke the line. The pass was taken, and 4 days later, Madrid opened its gates. Once again, it seemed Napoleon had restored order with sheer willpower, but he had underestimated the nature of the enemy. Spain was not like Prussia, nor was it like Austria or Italy. There was no single center of gravity to capture, no one capital whose fall would end the war. Spain was a land of mountains and villages, of local loyalties and deep-rooted religious conviction. For every army Napoleon defeated, a dozen new bands of partisans would rise. For every city he occupied, the countryside turned hostile. And just as Napoleon reached his zenith in Spain, another crisis emerged on the horizon. Unbeknownst to the French emperor, a British force of 20,000 men under General Sir John Moore had marched 300 miles inland from Lisbon. Their aim had been to join with Spanish armies and strike at the French rear, but by the time Moore reached Salamanca, the Spanish had already been defeated. The strategic situation had changed entirely. Moore, undeterred, devised a new plan. He would strike at Marshal Soult's isolated Second Corps in northern Spain. If he could destroy it, he might force Napoleon to divert troops, perhaps even abandon Madrid. At the Battle of Sahagun on the 21st of December, 1808, Moore's cavalry struck the French hard. The 15th Hussars, advancing under cover of frost and darkness, smashed a French brigade at dawn, routing it with devastating effect. But the victory came with a cost. The attack revealed Moore's position and intentions. Napoleon, furious and eager for a confrontation with the British, swung his main force north. He planned to trap Moore between his own army and Soult's corps. In bitter winter conditions, he led his men through the snowbound Guadarrama Pass. Enduring freezing winds and punishing blizzards, it was a grueling march. But Napoleon wanted blood. Moore saw the trap forming and ordered a full retreat. What followed was a desperate race to the coast. Moore's objective, the Spanish port of Coruña, where the Royal Navy could evacuate his men. It was a grueling 250-mile march through mountainous terrain. In the depths of winter, discipline collapsed. Many British soldiers fell behind. Some pillaged villages. Others froze. But the rear guard held firm, led by seasoned units like the elite 95th Rifle skirmishers dressed in dark green. Armed with rare rifles instead of muskets, they fought a series of delaying actions that slowed the French advance. Their precision shooting and flexibility turned them into a force far greater than their numbers. In one famed incident at Cacabellos, a rifleman named Tom Plunkett picked off a French general from an estimated 400 yards in, extraordinary feat of marksmanship at the time. The French were never quite able to close the gap. Then, on New Year's Eve, 1808, just as Napoleon's forces neared their prey, word arrived from Paris. Austria was mobilizing again. Rumors of conspiracies swirled. Trouble was brewing at home. Napoleon, recognizing the greater threat, left Spain almost immediately, taking many of his best units with him. Marshal Soult was left to finish the pursuit. The chase did not end with Napoleon's departure. Marshal Soult, seasoned and unrelenting, continued his pursuit through the Galician hills. His Second Corps pressed hard on the retreating British, hoping to destroy them before they could escape by sea. On the 11th of January, 1809, Moore's weary army finally reached the port city of Coruña. They were starved, frostbitten, and exhausted from weeks of forced marches. Many had marched barefoot. Supplies were dwindling, but the sea, at last, was in sight, and with it, a glimmer of salvation. There was only one problem. The Royal Navy was not there. On the 11th, only a few ships bobbed in the harbor. Moore, despaired to evacuate, ordered bridges blown and roads blocked to delay the French. The gamble paid off. 3 days later, the rest of the British fleet arrived. With immense urgency, Moore began embarking his cavalry and artillery, anything that could be loaded quickly. But on the 15th of January, Soult's army appeared on the southern hills overlooking Coruña. They had caught up. The French moved swiftly. Artillery was dragged into position on the heights of Peninsular, where it could dominate the British defenses below. Both armies were roughly equal, in number 16,000 men apiece, but only the French still had cavalry, in the form of 4 regiments of dragoons. The British cavalry had already been evacuated. Moore's men would have to stand and fight with infantry alone. The terrain, however, favored the defenders. It was broken, jagged, filled with hedgerows, walls, and olive trees. This made it difficult for cavalry to maneuver and neutralize the French advantage. Moore deployed half his army south of the city, forming a line 2 miles long. The rest of his force, under General Fraser, held back to secure the right flank and the heights of Santa Margarita. Soult aimed to smash through Moore's right, turning the line and trapping the British between his advancing troops and the sea. At 2 p.m., French guns opened fire, pounding the British positions. Then General Mermet's division surged forward, supported by cavalry on the left. Moore, who had just ordered General Paget's division to embark, had to react quickly. He countermanded the order and rushed Paget's men to the open right flank. Fraser's division was also moved up to reinforce the Santa Margarita heights. The battle quickly became a swirling, chaotic melee. French columns advanced through narrow lanes and stone walls, exchanging fire with British skirmishers. The British 42nd Highlanders and the 50th Regiment of Foot launched a ferocious counterattack, pushing into the village of Elvina and driving out the French. But the fighting was confused and brutal. In the narrow streets, the French regrouped and countercharged, pushing the Highlanders back toward their original lines. Sir John Moore, ever hands-on, remained close to the front. He was determined to hold the line until the embarkation could be completed. As he gave orders and encouraged his officers, disaster struck. A French cannonball tore through his shoulder. Moore did not cry out. He did not fall immediately. But those who rushed to his side saw the truth. His shoulder was shattered, his chest mangled, He was dying. As he was carried from the field, still conscious, Moore asked only that his men continue the fight and that no time be wasted on him. His composure never wavered. Command passed to General Sir John Hope. The fight raged on. Soult threw in Murrell's division to press the attack on Elvina, hoping to crack the British left. But now Paget's division, including the ever-steady 95th Rifles, had reached the front. They took up positions along the right flank and began pouring accurate fire into the advancing French. The terrain was so jagged that even the dragoons dismounted to fight on foot. The French were brave, but the British defense was unyielding. Paget's men slowly drove the French back, threatening to envelop Marmet's division and halt the main thrust. Meanwhile, on the far right, General de la Borde's troops attempted to capture the village of Piedrolonga, but were slowed by thick hedges, stone fences, and relentless British skirmishing. By 6 p.m., as dusk fell over the battered landscape, the fighting gradually subsided. The battlefield was littered with the dead and dying, shrouded in the gray silence of exhaustion. Then, a final message reached Moore. The line had held. The evacuation could continue. He died that night, around 8 p.m. in the city he had struggled to reach. His final words were brief, solemn, and defiant. I hope the people of England will be satisfied. I have done my duty. Even in death, Moore had bought time. That night, under cover of darkness and flickering campfires, the British silently pulled back from their positions and began boarding the ships. Sentries were left behind to maintain the illusion of presence. By morning, the lines were empty. The French were slow to react. It wasn't until midday that Soult was able to bring up his artillery and fire on the harbor. By then, most of the British force had already boarded. A few transport ships ran aground. 2 were set alight to avoid capture. But the vast majority of Moore's army escaped intact, bruised, but not broken. Coruña's small Spanish garrison held the city just long enough for the evacuation to finish. Once the British had sailed beyond the horizon, they surrendered to the French. The campaign had cost Moore his life. It had tested British resolve, strained French logistics, and introduced a new, deadly rhythm to the war. No longer would battles be fought only between professional armies on open fields. Now the cities, villages, and mountains of Spain would become the battleground, and the war would drag on year after bloody year. Sir John Moore's retreat and death at Coruña marked the end of a single campaign, but it was only the opening movement in a long and agonizing symphony of war that would echo across the Iberian Peninsula for 6 more years. What began as a calculated power grab by Napoleon had mutated into a quagmire roan that would become known to history as the Peninsular War. In Paris, the reaction to Moore's escape was mixed. Napoleon, by then back in the capital, and preparing for a renewed campaign against Austria, expressed contempt for Moore's retreat, but he had lost a chance to destroy Britain's only field army on the continent. Worse, the escape ensured that British forces would return, and next time, they would not come alone. The death of Moore was mourned in Britain, but his rearguard action had made him a national hero. He had demonstrated that British troops could stand against Napoleon's legions. His sacrifice and the efforts of his men had preserved the nucleus of a future army, one that Arthur Wellesley, now vindicated and soon reinstated, would mold into a force capable of challenging French domination, not only in Portugal, but deep into the heart of Spain. Meanwhile, the myth of French invincibility already cracked at, by land continued to erode. Though Napoleon had briefly imposed order on Spain through sheer force of arms, his departure in early 1809 marked a turning point. His marshals, though brilliant in the field, lacked his political instincts. France's grip on the peninsula remained tenuous, especially in the face of widespread revolt and religious resistance. And here lies one of the most overlooked dimensions of the Peninsular War: its psychological and cultural fury. The Spanish did not simply see the French as invaders. They saw them as defilers of their faith, their traditions, their monarch, and their very identity. In a time when religion still governed every aspect of life in rural Iberia, French secularism was an existential threat. The suppression of the clergy, the imposition of modern legal codes, the abolition of the Inquisition, these reforms, intended by Napoleon to bring progress, were seen by ordinary Spaniards as sacrilege. Priests told their flocks that Napoleon was the Antichrist. Churches became centers of resistance. Icons and saints were carried into battle. And in a bitter twist, many of the very reforms Napoleon attempted to bring to Spain: equal rights, abolition of feudal privileges, civil administration, were now permanently stained with the blood of his soldiers. The Enlightenment, imposed at the tip of a bayonet, had found its most impassioned enemies. The violence on both sides deepened. French soldiers, unable to distinguish between armed partisans and civilians, resorted to collective punishment. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were burned, hostages were shot, women were raped, children were killed. The Spanish, in turn, tortured prisoners, mutilated corpses, and ambushed supply lines with pitiless cruelty. Francisco Goya, who had once painted courtly portraits for the Spanish nobility, turned his gaze to this horror. In a series of etchings titled "The Disasters of War," he revealed the full brutality of the conflict: bodies hanging from trees, executions, starvation, madness. No side was spared. It was not propaganda, it was testimony. By 1809, the war had grown into something Napoleon had not anticipated. No longer a simple rebellion, it had become a national resistance movement and a crucible for British strategy in Europe. Arthur Wellesley returned to Portugal that year and quickly set about reorganizing the defenses. Understanding the importance of geography and logistics, he fortified lines around Lisbon, known as the Lines of Torres Vedras, vast system of forts and redoubts designed to halt any French advance from the east. He refused to overextend his forces, instead baiting the French into drawn-out campaigns where supply shortages and guerrilla attacks would slowly bleed them dry. This slow-grinding war of attrition was alien to French doctrine. Napoleon's armies were trained to win quickly decisive battles, rapid marches, the total collapse of enemy armies, but Spain offered no such victory. Every time a city was taken, guerrillas harassed the French on the roads. Every time a general declared the rebellion over, a new uprising would begin. There was no center to strike, no capital whose capture could end the war. Spain was a hydra cut off one head, and two more appeared, and all the while, Britain deepened its foothold. The Royal Navy ensured a constant flow of supplies. British gold supported Spanish and Portuguese militias. British officers trained and equipped native forces, helping to form a coalition army that grew stronger by the month. Wellesley's victories at Talavera, then later at Busaco and Salamanca, gradually shifted the momentum. French losses were mounting, morale was fading. By 1812, even as Napoleon prepared for his disastrous invasion of Russia, Spain was slipping from his grasp. The Peninsular War had become a fatal drain on French resources, seeing down hundreds of thousands of troops, destroying any hope of using Spain as a springboard for further conquest, and emboldening resistance movements elsewhere in Europe. And yet, despite the blood and sacrifice, Spain was shattered. Its economy had collapsed. Its cities were ruined. Its population was decimated by war, disease, and famine. The monarchy, once restored, would bring back many of the reactionary policies the French had tried to eliminate, but the old world could not fully return. The war had awakened a sense of national identity that would, over time, reshape Spanish politics and ignite colonial revolutions from Mexico to Argentina. The Peninsular War also forged a new image of Britain not merely as a maritime power, but as a land power capable of standing toe-to-toe with Napoleon's empire. The lessons Wellesley learned in Portugal and Spain, discipline of logistics, the value of combined arms, the importance of local support would culminate at Waterloo, and for Napoleon, Spain became the wound that never healed. Years later, during his exile on St. Helena, he reflected bitterly on the affair. "I embarked pretty badly on this affair," he admitted. "The immorality showed too obviously. The injustice was too cynical. The whole of it remains very ugly." He was right. The Peninsular War did not end in a single decisive moment. It dragged on its final chapters written in blood, mud, and the slow unraveling of French power. Even after Napoleon's crushing defeat in Russia in 1812, even after the fires of Moscow and the frozen bones along the Beresina, the guerrillas of Spain kept fighting. They did not wait for orders. They needed no banners. Their war was personal. By 1813, the tide had irrevocably turned. Napoleon's grip on Europe was weakening. The Sixth Coalition, emboldened by his failures, rose against him. Wellesley, now the Duke of Wellington, his multinational force from Portugal, into the very heart of Spain. Victory followed victory. At Salamanca, then Vittoria. In 1814, he crossed the Pyrenees, bringing the war to French soil itself. France, the conqueror, had become the besieged. Joseph Bonaparte, once crowned King of Spain with imperial pomp, fled ignominiously his rule, a farce from beginning to end. The French army, once the finest in the world, staggered home in fragments, and the people of Spain, battered and bloodied, were left among the ruins of their land, victorious but not unscathed. The Peninsular War left wounds deeper than the physical. It had begun as a cynical imperial ploy, Napoleon's attempt to tighten the Continental System and humiliate an aging monarchy. It became a nightmare, an unwinnable war that drained France of men, money, and morale. In the field, it exposed the limits of French military supremacy. In diplomacy, it gave Britain the continental toehold it had so long sought, and in the collective imagination of Europe, it signaled something even more profound: that the emperor was not invincible, that even the greatest military genius of his age could be resisted not just by generals, but by farmers, priests, and riflemen. But for Spain, the legacy was more complex. Though the French had been expelled, the victory left a vacuum. The restored Bourbon monarchy, led by Ferdinand VII, proved even more reactionary and oppressive than before. The liberal constitution promised during the uprising was dismantled. Political instability followed. The very war that had been fought in the name of national liberation ended with many of its ideals betrayed, yet the spirit had changed. The people had discovered their power not through royal decree, but through struggle. The first flames of Spanish nationalism, lit amid guerrilla warfare and cathedral sermons, would continue to burn throughout the 19th century, shaping revolutions both at home and in the colonies abroad. Portugal, meanwhile, survived with British protection. It retained its sovereignty. Lisbon became the springboard for Britain's continental strategy. And the alliance between Britain and Portugal, one of the oldest in Europe, emerged from the war, stronger than ever. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Peninsular War lies in what it revealed about warfare itself. This was not a gentleman's war of maneuver and honor. It was brutal, personal, and total. Civilians were not bystanders, they were targets. Fighters, victims, supply lines were fair game, morality was suspended, cities starved, villages vanished. And long before the term total war entered the modern lexicon, the Peninsular War had already shown what it looked like, and it birthed new kinds of heroes. The British 95th Rifles, green-coated and rifle-armed, became the prototype for future light infantry, small, agile, precise, and independent-minded. Their tactics, honed in the back roads of Spain, influenced military doctrine for generations. Sir John Moore, dead before his legacy could fully unfold, became a model of stoic duce general who gave everything not for glory, but to save his men. Arthur Wellesley, tested in the crucible of the peninsula, I would rise to command the Allied forces that finally defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. But it was in the dusty roads of Spain and Portugal, not Belgium, that he learned how to break the French machine. And then there was Goya, his Disasters of War series, drawn from the horrors he witnessed, marked a rupture in the way art addressed conflict. Gone were the triumphal depictions of battles, the heroic poses of monarchs. In their place, blood, sorrow, madness, civilians gunned down, mothers weeping, men hanged from trees. Goya painted not for kings, but for history itself. His images remain, perhaps, the most haunting record of what war cost not just to soldiers, but to the soul of a nation. Yet, even as the war ended and the world shifted into the post-Napoleonic age, questions remained. Why did Napoleon choose to intervene in Spain in the first place? Why did he not recognize the warning signs? Was it ambition, arrogance, or had he, perhaps, begun to believe too deeply in his own myth? Spain was not merely a strategic blunder, it was a moral one. Avar built on decide. Masked as liberation, a nation treated as a pawn, and in that moral erosion, Napoleon's empire revealed its darkest flaw. It could conquer land, but not hearts. It could rewrite laws, but not beliefs. And when the people rose, it had no answer but the bayonet. In the end, Napoleon himself seemed to recognize this. Years later, reflecting from his lonely exile, he would call Spain the ulcer that destroyed me. He was not wrong. For all the grand victories of his reign, for all the imperial glory and military brilliance, it was in the hills of Iberia that the seed of his downfall took root. Not in a clash of titans, but in the silent march of a retreating army, in the stubborn resistance of peasants with knives, in the cold body of a British general who died to give his men one more day. The Peninsular War did not decide the fate of Europe in a single stroke, but it changed the tempo of resistance. It drew blood from the empire's core, and it proved, once and for all, that even emperors bleed. And perhaps that is history's most enduring lesson. It is not always the strong who win, nor the righteous who survive, but those who refuse to surrender, who, in the face of terror, cruelty, and despair, choose to stand anyway. Those are the ones who shape the future.